Let's go back to the research. You mentioned you do a lot of research, and one of the things that I love about your writing is that you use these sort of cultural touchstones for everything, not only to present place, but also character. So I'm going to take a little page out of Bury Me Deep, which is the one from last year. Here, her eyes bounced off everything. The gleaming stand mixer on the kitchen counter that still had store tags on it, a silver-toned cathedral radio, an amber decanter with cordial glasses, a portable Cariola master phonograph, a silver-plated ice bucket into which someone, Louise, she'd guessed, had dumped peppermint candies of the kind they kept in the children's ward at the clinic. Random, she thought, to have such a high-toned radio, but only a rickety card table on which to eat. And over there, a hot point samovar that stood 18 inches tall and must have held 12 cups of coffee, all for 2 girls, yet only one easy chair with thin velvet worn through to the spongy netting beneath. And I love the way that you set us there using the same sort of consumerism that is reflected in our culture now, but to set that up, I don't think that's something you find a whole lot in the literature of the time.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting. And I know in my first book in the 50s, there's a lot of description, you know, in a far more consumer time of the dishware. I have a thing with dishware, clearly. That's what I'm learning about myself right now. But I think this wasn't conscious, but I'm thinking, 50s consumerism, products really mattered, and names mattered, and advertising was so big. And of course, in the 30s, and these are women who are very much in a state of deprivation. They're really living on the edge of deep poverty. And so these objects are sort of like the thing that's protecting them from the abyss. As long as men will buy them 12-cup samovars, everything will be okay. So they mean a lot more than, samovar sometimes is not just a samovar. I didn't even know what a samovar is, but no, I know exactly what it is because I also collect these things. But yeah, they have, this sort of cultural weight, things matter. And I always try to tell myself that when I sort of get bothered by these sort of books where they talk about Manolo Blahniks and and sort of designer stuff, but it's really the same thing. It means a lot. The cultural coinage for those things matters, I think, and tells you a lot about the moment, the historical moment.
And you get in your time machine and go back to the 30s in order to figure out what's what. The most common research technique I have is looking at old magazines, and that that I collect them at flea markets, and especially with the early 30s, this sort of official history doesn't provide you with a lot of that stuff, but these magazines are so wonderful. These ladies' magazines, where you'll see not only the ads, which are great for finding out about the samovars, but they're the style that everything is written in, the language was so different in the early 30s versus the 1940s, for instance. It seems like it was decades apart, and I think that's because of the rise of talkies and the sort of flattening out of American speech. But only by reading a lot of these 1930s magazines that was able to capture the parlance and the sort of weird mix of formal language and slang, and this sort of so I sort of find the sort of mass culture, the sort of toss-away culture, the transitory things are the best research tools for me. So magazines are perfect. And I get the sense that you have a lot of them at home.
I do. I live in a tiny New York apartment, but I do have quite a bit, and I have a lot of men's magazines. The sort of naughty magazines of the day, which are fabulous. And I realized that men's magazines haven't changed at all. That was the one thing I've learned. There's a little nuances, but they're exactly the same, including the ads in the back. But yeah, I am a compulsive collector of them, and I will give away almost anything to keep those in my tiny apartment.
When we were touring around the archive earlier today, she saw the movable shelving and coveted it.
I did. That would solve all my problems.
You did have, the song is You.
is based on a real-life crime from the 40s and 50s. I guess she disappeared in 49,
Right.
but most of the book takes place in the 50s. But the main character, the protagonist, is actually the one male protagonist that you have. His story is not the arch of the story. But I've noticed that when I went back and read them, that book is so much more vulgar than the rest. It's as if you're putting men on guard, and this is how we act around.
Oh, no. I love, it's not first person, but it is a male protagonist, and he's sort of my most beloved character. I think it's probably vulgar because it's his job more than that he's a man. He's a publicist, studio publicist, and I read a lot about, studio publicists were the dirty laundry keepers of the era, and they sort of knew all the secrets, and they knew all, their world was a dirty world. And I just, my two main inspirations for him as a character were William Holden in Sunset Boulevard and Tony Curtis in Sweet Smell of Success. They were my two favorite, my taste in men is not great, but those two guys are it for me, and they both sort of have to deal with they're bottom feeders, and I think that probably explains the vulgarity more than anything else. I loved always the first Hollywood fiction I read was James Ellroy, and that was a revelation to me, having grown up on Hollywood movies. And when I was in high school, I read him, and he was dealing with all the same people and all the same. These people, Rita Hayworth, but he was sort of showing what was underneath. He used to take the lid off Los Angeles. And so, in part, that book is sort of wanting to sort of crawl down in there with him.
The latest book, Bury Me Deep, is also based on true crime.
Right.
You've alternated so far in this real crime, complete fiction. What's the attraction of fictionalizing the real crime for you?
Boy, and in fact, they all are. I just didn't acknowledge it. But all my books have been, two of them I acknowledge it, and Bury Me Deep in the Song Was You, but the other two are too. I just, I think that was my first love in books, was true crime. And Hollywood Babylon, I think, was the big one for me as a kid. That was sort of my dirty book. And I just was so haunted by it. And so that's always been my access point. Somehow the inspiration had to come from something real. And maybe it was sort of a failure of imagination on my part or something. But I also like having the freedom of then being able to do what I want with it. So I'm fictionalizing it, but it has this sort of basis for me in the real. It was strange with Bury Me Deep, though, because it's so clearly based on the real life crime, and the first half of the book follows very closely the real life case. It's set in Phoenix, where the crime occurred, and when I went there on book tour, I met two people who knew the principals. Who were old enough to remember, and it was the most uncanny experience because I had somehow, in my obnoxious author way, forgotten that this was I didn't forget, but I hadn't thought about it in that very real way of having someone stand in front of me and say, I knew Winnie Ruth Judd, and it was sort of like a cold water in the face in the best way, because it reminded me of, that these are real lives. And the reason I was drawn to the story in the first place was because it's the pathos of the real life case.
Well, it was 80 years ago. I mean, how could you expect that there would be people hanging around?
I try to set them, I'm going to set them further and further.
Coming to the bookstore, no less.
Yeah, I know. It could have been a problem, but...